Is stretching good for you or bad for you? Dr. Miller with a video on this ambiguous and actually underappreciated, understood concept of stretching. The answer, like many things in the field of exercise and sports science, is it depends. It depends on who is asking the question and what specific joint they may be asking about. So let's break this down a little bit. This video would have to be a whole series of videos, which it's probably going to turn into at some point, but I'm not going to try to download every bit of information. I'm going to stick to the question specifically. So we can argue over mobility, flexibility, all these different concepts, but I want to stick to the question. Is stretching good? Not dynamic, not passive right now, or PNF or anything else, just this general idea. Okay, so again, we can go down a lot of rabbit holes here, or rabbit trails here, and all of them have interesting topics, and that's the part of it depends. That's very, very important. But in general, this is what I would relay, is the research literature a lot of times uses passive stretching and compares some sort of injury outcome. And says, okay, if you stretch, then you reduce this injury, hamstrings or whatever it may be. Or I've seen where the research literature, there's stretch, and they actually pick up a higher likelihood of injury. Or the type of stretching could cause injuries or soreness, which, there's a lot of things going on here. So my general answer to it depends would be, again, who are we talking about? So if we look at somebody head to toe, and we could determine by doing, goniometer assessments or any sort of dynamic even assessment, that they were stiff. I mean, every single joint in their body was below what the clinical tolerances are for passive range of motion, and or they failed every single one of the dynamic tests, whether that's a Starbounce excursion test or the functional movement screen trademark, whatever it may be, they didn't do well on every single one. They were substandard. So then we could say, well, for that person, if full body passive stretching or dynamic stretching, whatever would be appropriate, okay, again, I don't want to go down that trail just yet, would be appropriate for them, go ahead and stretch. But if we found that they did well, maybe their shoulder mobility is determined by a dynamic test, or their shoulder flexibility as determined by a goniometer, or again, we could have some crossover there, okay, again, I'm not arguing that. But we determined the shoulders are fine, let's just say that, but their hips are tight. Then we wouldn't want to overly stretch the shoulder to try to create more range of motion than is necessary. Once you meet the standard, more range of motion, unless you're talking about an aesthetic sport, is not required, okay? And so trying to increase the range of motion, either dynamic or passive, is potentially increasing the likelihood for injury. Where in the hips, they were tight, and so bringing them up to whatever the standard is makes sense. And so you might spend time mobilizing or stretching, whatever's appropriate for whatever outcome that you're trying to achieve. Again, not going into specifics yet. You might stretch the hips and leave the shoulders alone, or just maintenance the shoulders, okay? So the full body routine is out. It's understanding joint to joint. You could look at it, if you're a strength coach, you could look at a team and make assumptions about, as a team, because of the type of sport they play, that they might have bad ankle mobility, okay, or ankle range of motion, okay? And so, when we're trying to figure out is stretching good or bad, it's not that simple. And that's where the research literature also struggles at times with, well, stretching's good, stretching's bad. Well, it depends on the time of stretching, depends on the outcome, and many times it depends on the people we start with. If you start with clinically stiff people, stretching may be a good thing for just saying full body needed, or if we're just looking at one joint, again, that may be a good thing. If somebody's already mobile enough, or even hypermobile, increasing the frequency or the intensity or all of these variables, the duration of the stretch, in other words, to increase range of motion or mobility, is not going to be a good idea, and in fact cause joint instability. Now we have an issue where we can't control in these extreme end ranges of motion that we've created, these new ranges of motion we've created. We don't have the stability involved, and so if we get into those end ranges of motion, now we can pick up an injury. So I hope you find that helpful when you're starting to assess. Again, there's so many variables here when it comes to what type of stretching, what's the outcome, how do we address that outcome, what, warm up versus, not warming up, or a warm down, cool down type of stretch. I mean, when should we do it? I mean, there's so many questions I can, slowly work my way through these topics. But just to start, I think this simple question can keep you out of the weeds when it comes to making bad or good decisions about stretching. You say, oh, I don't need to stretch. Well, maybe you do. Most people could benefit from some ankle mobility if they're squatting a lot, well, just in general. Especially if people sit at desks and they're more in plantar flexion a lot of the day, they could benefit. As somebody who is seated a long periods of time, depending how their posture is arranged, but if they're in a posterior pelvic tilt all day, and their knees are bent, you can expect their hamstrings to be tight and their lower back to be tight. Now, how we would stretch a lower back, I would stretch a lower back, but how we address that issue will be different from the issue with hamstrings being tight. We could stretch those in a traditional manner, but the lower back, we might not do necessarily a static stretch for. It's certainly like a PNF stretch. So again, this is where a lot of the nuance will come in. But the general question of stretch or not, I think is a little more, is easier to identify. Stretch what needs to be stretched and leave alone what is fine, or maintenance what is fine. In fact, in some cases, don't even maintenance, just leave it alone. I've met hypermobile athletes or hypermobile joints of athletes. I've met a hypermobile athlete before, and she was a distance runner. I told her never stretch again, and she was mortified, right? Well, for her, at least for a time, she needs to get stiffer. And so continuing to stretch, even maintaining what she has, is only making it more difficult for her to stay healthy, and it's making it difficult for her to increase her performance. So I hope you find that valuable as you're starting to assess a flexibility routine. I think sometimes we just blindly go into stretching. We don't really think through, just like we do weight training or any other type of training. We need to think through what we're trying to accomplish and what needs to be done, if anything. If you like this video, like it, of course, because that would make sense. That's a natural flow. Like the video if you like it. Drop a comment below if you disagree with me or agree with me. Of course, I'd love for you to agree with me because that would affirm all my biases. And of course, subscribe to the channel. Lots of content coming out, and a variety of topics from nutrition science to even weightlifting and these different areas that I've been traveled over my career. So I'll see you in the